There you go. You're recording.
Hey everybody, this is Caleb with CK Studios. Tonight we're back with another tutorial for Thursday night. We just came off of a really nice, successful paint class this weekend. And one of the requests that I got from some of the students was that we do a little bit of the cleaning and kind of the setup for the airbrush in a video. Because they saw it, but a couple of them can't remember quite the steps and stuff like that. So they asked that we go over that real quick. So I figured that would be a good topic for tonight. And then, of course, we'll open it up to questions and stuff, too. So the first thing that I want to do is talk about paint prep. I guess a lot of people were wondering about that with PSI. A lot of questions came up with PSI. How do I know if I'm shooting the right PSI or the wrong PSI or whatever? So figuring PSI is relatively simple. What we're going to do is we're going to prep our paint. We need to kind of know how to prep our paint. I won't go over our paint prep tonight, but we should have a good idea of what we want to do with our paint. If we're base coating or something like that, we're going to want our paint to be a little thicker, a little heavier. If we're doing some more detail work or trying to do some real smooth blends or some tints, fades, something like that, we're going to want to thin our paint down. The thinner we can get our paint, the lower we can get our air pressure, the finer the airbrush is going to spray. So that's kind of the relationship between the air pressure and the paint. So there's a real easy way to check it. Is what I do is I'm first going to prep my paint, roughly kind of put it how I like, and then I can test to see if my paint, I'm going to crank my air pressure up a little bit real quick. I can test to see how my airbrush is spraying. And we have a couple signs of what our airbrush is doing. So once we start spraying our paint and we've got it all prepped, we've got it in the airbrush, and we start to notice that we're getting a really dense spray, we're getting a lot of heavy dots. It almost looks textured because we're getting a lot of dots, a little bumps and stuff like that. What's going on is our paint is either too thick or our air pressure is too low. So if we know that we're priming and like priming or base coating, and say that we're using like an airbrush ready paint, if you're not using an airbrush ready paint, you're really gonna have to pay attention to how you prep your paint. But if we're using an airbrush ready paint, we're spraying it in a 0.4 nozzle like the Patriot or something like that, we know that we're going to roughly be able to shoot that paint without problem. So if we're getting that heavy texture, that heavy dot, stuff like that, it means our PSI is too low. We're going to crank up our PSI. That's going to help with that. Now, if we're getting our paint and we're spraying it and it's actually drying before it hits the surface, or we're getting a lot of overspray, a lot of very fine spray, our air pressures might be too high. And that's what we run into. The danger is with high air pressures. I mean, you can definitely crank the air pressure up and crush paint, when you're pushing it through the brush. But at a certain point, air pressure is going to become too high, and we're going to either dry, like I said, we're going to deal with a lot of dry tip. We're going to have the paint drying as it's flying to the surface of the model. It's going to start to stick and build up and stuff like that. Or we're going to have, we'll end up with the paint, when it hits the surface of the model, it starts to roll and push. So I'll show you kind of a couple ways to figure that out. So once we kind of know what the brush is doing, we know that our paint's kind of prepped right. We can kind of figure out our air pressure. So I'm going to switch over to my other camera real quick, and we'll take a look at just a little simple kind of like, not necessarily exercise, but just kind of a simple routine that you can have when you're painting to prep your paint. So here I have a couple of cards. I want I don't want to spray like on a paper towel or like a regular piece of paper, something like that, because what will happen is the paint will soak in. We won't be able to see what our paint's doing. But by having a slightly glossy finish, I like a business card finish. It's got like a slightly plasticky finish. It's going to be very similar to the surface we're spraying on. We can kind of check our paint there. So once I have my paint loaded, what I can do is I'll come in and I'll just spray a few lines. I'm going to go ahead and load some paint. I'm going to spray some lines. And you're going to notice when I'm spraying those lines that I've got a couple of issues going on. Is one, I've got this spidering right here where my paint is kind of getting legs, it's kind of running out. You'll also notice there's a really heavy overspray. So where my line is, I have a very big fade of paint around it. I've got these spidering right here. And the other thing is you'll notice is the center of this line is a lot thinner than the edges. I start to get these really dark edges on the sides. What's happening is my paint is either too thin or my air pressure is too high. And so when the paint goes in and blows, it's going to push that paint up to the edges. And it's going to kind of blow out away from the center so that the paint's kind of spraying in and then it's curling out as it goes. So I know I can do one of two things. I can either go in and thicken up my paint, or I can go ahead and lower my air pressure. So if I'm doing some detail work, I know that I have my paint relatively thin, I'm going to go ahead and lower my air pressure. And so that's what I'll do now. And I'm going to come in and with my air pressure a lot lower, I'm going to come in and spray. Now you'll notice here, I've lowered my air pressure. I'm going to go ahead and spray those lines again. Now you see how I'm not getting a really smooth spray now. You can see that I'm getting a lot of dots. There's not a real defined line. I'm getting a lot of dots. It's very hazy. And if you can look really closely, you'll notice there's that it's kind of got like a texture buildup. There's a lot of dots and heavy dots in there. So what's happening now is my air pressure is too low. My air cannot properly mix with the paint. It's not atomizing the paint, so I'm not getting the fine dots that I should be getting. The paint's trying to clump together, and it's holding together, and the air is just barely pushing out the brush. The other thing that we'll notice if we have like the little prongs and stuff on the end of our brush right here, we're going to notice that paint wants to kind of stick right in there because we're not getting enough air pressure to kind of clear everything off. So that's how
Caleb?
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Tim would like to know, what is the distance from the paper you recommend to test with the paper? And you've got someone +1 the question on that.
I'm going to roughly be about 3 inches. We're going to be the same distance that we're spraying. So if we want a wider spray, like a base coat spray, we're going to be about 3 or 4 inches away from the model. If we're going to go in and do some fine detailing, we're going to get a lot closer to the model. I'm going to be 1 inch or 2 away from the model. So it's going to really depend on what application we're doing. But on average, I'm usually 3 to 4 inches away from the model for most of the sprays. So for the testing, that's a really good distance to be away from the model. It won't really matter too much how far. I mean, if you're like 6 or 8 inches away from the paper, you're not going to really be able to define your spray. But if we hold it relatively close to the paper, we're going to be able to test. It's not super critical to be a certain distance.
Nice.
So what I did now was I went ahead and just brought my air pressure back up. And now I'm shooting, I'm roughly at about, whoops, I was turning it the wrong way, that's why. So now I'm roughly at about 15 PSI or so. I did thin the paint out for this technique. I just took some Minotaur paint and thinned it out a little bit. I wanted it to really react oddly. So now I have it just about right. You're going to notice now I get a nice even spray. My line is nice and even. Usually at the top of my spray, I'm going to get just a little bit denser because I can't move the brush quick enough. But you'll notice I have a very nice full spray. The lines are very even all the way across. So the width of the line is nice and even. I don't have a lot of overspray. I mean, I have a little bit of overspray because I'm shooting a very thin paint, but I don't have a lot of overspray. I'm getting a nice even line, and then the line is nice and even across the cell. I'm not getting a lot of weird spatters. I'm not getting a lot of spidering, paint running, stuff like that. So now I know that I'm in a pretty good spot, and I can go ahead and start shooting on the model. So this is a really good technique to have. You can totally go back and just keep reusing the same pieces of paper. You don't need to throw the paper away every time you do it. You just keep coming back. I mean, color, you're going to get a good feel for it. After a little while, you know, you do this long enough, you'll get to the point where this is kind of, you don't need it anymore. You'll be able to look at the paint and go, okay, I know exactly how thick I am, or I know exactly how thin I need to be. You can kind of just look at the paint and know, okay, that's where I need to be. And then as soon as I start shooting, I can tell, and I'll adjust my air pressure at that point. So that's kind of it. I mean, in a nutshell, that's really how we're going to determine our air pressures. We're going to start, I mean, a good rule of thumb is start somewhere from 15 to 20 PSI. Every time that we're getting ready to paint, start somewhere in the 15 to 20 PSI, and then adjust your air pressure from there. That's the best thing to do. Don't try to start at a really low air pressure and then slowly build your way up. Try to just hold it right at that certain pressure. So that's air pressure. Pretty basic. And then what I want to talk about next was how to flush out the brush, because a lot of people were asking that question and they wanted to go over the cleaning technique. So my cleaning technique is very basic. I don't use like the little spray pot that you can put the paint in and stuff like that. I just use a dump technique. I have a big garbage can beside me that I usually use, but for this I'll use just this little cup here. When I'm done, or I need to do a color change, or I'm gonna put my brush away for the night. The techniques are all the same. It's just how far I'm gonna go with it. So the first thing I like to have is these bottles with the spray ends are pretty much essential for this. I have the other spray bottles, but the problem is you have to tip the bottle upside down to be able to get the pressure out of it. With this, you don't have to tip the bottle over. You can squeeze it, and you'll see why that's important. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my airbrush, I'm going to hold it over the cup like this, and I'm just going to take my water and I'm going to squirt it into the cup. And you can see here, I'm just going to blow all the excess paint out of the cup. So if you look in the cup here, you can see I've got just a little bit of water in there. Most of the excess paint's out. I'm going to go ahead and just dump all that paint. I'm going to put a little bit of water in there. Then I'm going to take a paper towel. And I'm just going to go directly into the paper towel like this. And I'm just going to spray until it gets nice and wet. You need to make sure that the towel is wet, because I'm going to put that towel right up against the needle. Now be careful at this point. Don't push against the needle or bend the needle or something like that. We just want to gently squeeze the entire tip of the needle until I can get the cup to back fill. You see how it's back bubbling like this. I want to back bubble it just a little bit. That's going to flush any paint that's still in the nozzle out. I'm going to dump that into the dump cup. I'm not going to shoot air through it, because if I shoot the air through the brush again, it's going to pull all that paint out. I want to make sure I take my squeeze bottle and I just flush everything that I just backflowed into the cup back out. I'm going to dump that out of the brush. I'm going to load up a little more water into my brush, and now I'm just going to go ahead and spray right into the paper towel. Now at this point, what I'm doing is I'm going to go back and forth with my trigger at full throttle, and then I'm just going to open and close that needle. I'm going to work that needle back and forth inside of the housing. That's going to help break loose any paint that's kind of collected in there. Then I'm going to take it with that wet thing, and I'm just going to gently just gently touch the needle. On the Patriot, I'm not so worried about this. I can do this. If this is a Sotar, or this is your Grex XGI, or your Infinity or something like that, you don't want to go in there and touch that needle with the paper towel like that, because you're going to bend it. What I'll do at that point is, with one of my finer brushes, is I'm just going to take a Q-tip. I'm going to take a Q-tip and I'm going to dip it. I usually have a little cup of alcohol right here. So imagine I have a cup of alcohol. I'm going to dip it into the alcohol, and I'm just going to run it right alongside the needle. And I'm going to go in little circles around the needle. I'm not going to push directly against the needle. I'm going to go up right next to it and then go in circles around it. I'm just going to clear the paint that's collected on the tip of the needle right there. Once that's done, I'm going to keep flushing. I'm going to go ahead and just burn an entire cup out of this, maybe 2 cups, until I know that there's no paint left in the cup. As soon as I'm spraying nice and clear, I know that I'm done with that. At this point, I can go ahead and do a color change. So I recommend this even if you're not necessarily changing colors, but say you loaded up a cup of paint and you sprayed through that cup because you're base coating tanks or something. As soon as I switch cups, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick flush. The more you flush, the better your brush is going to hold up. The less you're going to have less paint drying in there and stuff like that. So I like to try to flush between each cup, or definitely when I'm going to change a color, I'm going to do that flush. Now, once I've done that flush and say it's the end of the night and I'm ready to put the brush away, the next thing I'm going to do is, once I've gone through the brush and I've kind of cleared it the way I did, you're going to notice that there's some dried paint that's still in the cup right here. As I move it around, you'll see if there's just a little bit of red paint in there. I have some dry paint in there. I'm going to take some pure alcohol now, and I'm going to do the same technique. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put it in there, and I'm going to back bleed that alcohol. I don't need to dump at this point because I got rid of the majority of the major paint, but I do want to get that alcohol to start agitating inside that nozzle. Then I'm just going to go back and forth with the needle a few times, kind of get a bunch of alcohol on my paper towel. Once I have some alcohol in there, I'm going to go into the cup and I'm going to wipe all that paint that dried. I want to clear as much of that paint out as I can possibly get so that the inside of my cup is nice and clear. Then I'm going to continue, and I'm going to go ahead and spray out the rest of the alcohol that was in that. Then once that alcohol is done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my paper towel, or my Q-tip, I'm sorry. I'm going to dip it in that cup of alcohol. So imagine I'm in that cup of alcohol. I'm going to go in and I'm going to clear the very top of my needle inside that cup. Because what happens is we get some paint that's going to collect on that needle. Once that's done, I'm going to loosen up the back of my needle right here. I'm going to spin my needle 180, so at the bottom of the needle is now at the top of the needle. If you look down in there, normally you'll see a little bit of paint. I'm going to take that same alcohol Q-tip. I'm going to clean the top of that needle. What I want to do is clear the paint off of that needle, because I'm going to pull that needle out. If I still have paint on that needle, when I pull it out, I run the risk of running that paint through the Teflon seal that's right behind the cup. We want to protect that Teflon seal. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the needle out.
Will you move it up a little bit, Caleb?
I'm sorry?
There you go. I was just asking if you would move it up a little bit. It keeps going off screen for me.
Okay. So once I've pulled that needle, I'm going to take that paper towel that's got the alcohol on it, and I'm going to go ahead and pull towards the end of the needle. I'm going to pull away from me with the needle. I'm not going to try to clean this way, because I run the risk of sticking that needle through my hand. I'm going to go ahead and just grab from the back side, clear that needle real quick. I want to make sure that there's no paint that's dried there. Sometimes we're going to get some paint that's going to dry right here at the tip of the needle. All I'll do right here is I'll come in with my fingernail and I'll just gently scrape that paint off. We want to be real careful and gentle with the tip of our needle. Again, with the Patriot, it's pretty hardy. I don't need to be super gentle with it, but when you get into the finer, like 0.02 or 0.2 needles and stuff like that, they're really easy to bend. So we want to be real gentle with that. We always want to work away from the needle, work with the taper of the needle. Don't try to work against the taper. If we work against taper, we run the risk of clogging or of damaging the end of that needle. Once that's clear, I'm going to go in there, and again with that Q-tip, I'm going to dip it back into my cup of alcohol. I'm going to go in, I'm going to clear that trough real quick. I'm just going to gently get in here. Don't get in here and scrub this thing out or something like that. We run the risk of ruining that finish that's in there. I'm just going to gently kind of clean in here, kind of get all the loose paint that I can see in there. I'm going to go ahead and put the needle back in. When I put in the needle back in, we want to make sure that the trigger is seated. Sometimes this trigger will fall out just a little bit. If it's not seated, what can happen is that when we slide that needle back in, we can damage that. So the easiest way to do that is just make sure you disconnect your hose, come in and push on that trigger. You'll feel it rock back and forth. We can go ahead and slide the needle back in. Just gently slide it till it stops. Don't jam it in or something like that, because you don't want to damage that nozzle. Once that's set, I'll just gently tap it to make sure it's done. I'll tighten that up. Now I'm going to go ahead and with my brush, it's all clean inside. I know that I've got the tip nice and clean and everything like that. I'm going to take a couple of squirts of needle juice, and I don't see where I put my needle juice right now. It was packed up with the class. But anyways, I'm just going to take a couple drops of needle juice. I'm going to put it right inside the cup. All that's going to do is it's going to go in the needle. You notice I'm not connected to the air right now. I'm just going to put that needle juice in the brush. I'm going to run the trigger back and forth a couple times. It's just going to move that needle juice or airbrush lubricant. It's just going to move that a little bit around that needle. Then I'm going to take and I'm going to back off my needle hold right there. And I'm just going to back my needle off until my needle is not sticking out the front here anymore. I'm going to tighten it back up, and now I know that I'm ready to go to put it back in. The reason I back that needle off is two. One, with the needle not sticking out, I don't run the risk of dropping this and damaging the needle. The other thing is that no matter how finely you clean that brush, there's still going to be some microparticles of paint that are going to be mixed with the water that's inside here. When you push that needle all the way up against the nozzle and store it like that, what happens is that water in there evaporates, and that little bit, that micro fine layer of paint is going to glue itself, and it's going to glue the needle to the nozzle, and then you got to come in and try to break it loose and stuff like that. So it's easier if you just put some of that needle juice in, just back that needle off, back it up a little bit, lock it down. You still have the needle juice in there. It's gonna, or the needle juice, the airbrush lubricant, it's gonna be in there. You're good to go. That's the basics of cleaning the airbrush for me. I don't disassemble it. I don't tear the nozzle out and all of that stuff. The more we take the airbrush apart, the more likelihood that we're going to wear out some of the fine micro tolerance polishes that are inside the brush that are what create the seals. So the only time I'm ever going to take my brush apart like that and have to get the nozzle out and stuff like that to clean it is if I let paint dry in the brush. So that's kind of the basics for cleaning it. It's relatively simple. The more we do this, the more you clean, the more you do these flushes while you're painting. Try not to load your brush with a lot of paint. I try to just use a little bit. I don't even put like a full cup in this brush when I'm painting. I'll use maybe half a cup tops. Kind of a quarter cup. This is a big cup. That's a lot of paint in here. By the time you spray an entire cup out of this, the paint's going to start to clog around the sides. It's going to dry around the sides, stuff like that. So again, the more we can flush, the more we can clean, the better airbrush hygiene we have while we're working, the less problems we're going to have. So that leads me up to the next topic, which is problems with our airbrush. How do we define what our airbrush is doing? How do we troubleshoot it and figure out what's happening? So there's a few common problems that we run into, and there's some relatively short and simple fixes for it that I have. I mean, they're not necessarily the greatest fixes. They're not necessarily the only fixes. They're just what I like to do. The first one I'll talk about is dry tip. So a lot of times we're airbrushing. We want to make sure when we're spraying the airbrush that every few seconds that we come off the model and we do what's called clearing blast. I'm going to hit full air. I'm going to pull that throttle back and forth 3 or 4 times. I'm going to go full paint. I'm just going to shoot these splotches down onto like my paper or whatever. I always have like some spare paper or an area that I spray on. You guys can notice when I move the paper off of my work area, you can see all the little spots of paint from the airbrush. Because what I'll do is I'll be spraying on a model. I'll come off of it. I'm going to clear that brush. That's going to take clean, nice, wet paint, and it's going to shoot it across the needle. It's going to kind of grab anything that's starting to dry, starting to thicken up, and it's going to pull it off of the needle. If I'm not doing that, you're going to be spraying. You're going to notice that all of a sudden you start to spray, and you're going to notice that your brush starts to slow down. You're starting to have to pull a lot more trigger and a lot more trigger to get the same technique. At this point, it means that we're starting to clog. Our tip is clogging. We're getting some dry tip. We're getting some paint that's drying in the nozzle, stuff like that. It doesn't mean that we need to dump all the paint out of the brush, go in and clean it, take it all apart so we can get the painting. A really quick fix to that is as soon as it starts to do that and you're noticing that you're losing some air pressure, take that wet rag that we have and we're going to do that same thing, and we're just going to back bubble that thing. I just boom like this. It's going to back bubble into the cup. It's going to push all that paint that's in the nozzle back out. It's going to clear any of that paint that's drying in the nozzle. I'm going to come now. I'm not going to go back onto the model. I'm going to come back over here to my clearing area, and I'm going to work that needle back and forth a few times. Once I do that, you're going to notice all of a sudden, you start to get a nice fine spray. We're back to painting. So now we need to just be cognizant to make sure we're coming off the model. Now, if you've done that and you've cleared it and you start spraying and within a few seconds it starts to clog up again and you clear it again and it starts to do the same thing, well, now there's something wrong with our paint. Either our paint wasn't prepped properly, we have some chunks in our paint, we have some slightly dried or congealed paint, so we're dealing with that. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to have to dump the airbrush. We're not going to be able to do that back bleed and clear it. So at that point, yes, we're going to have to clear the brush. You're going to have to do a full flush. You're going to have to go in and do all the technique that I just did. You're going to take and clear the brush with the water. We're going to go ahead and back bleed it. We're going to dump it. We're going to clear the brush again, and we're going to shoot until we're shooting clear water out of it again. Then we're going to look at our paint, make sure that our paint is prepped properly. We're going to start painting at that point. One reason that normally happens is our mixing cup. So I always encourage people to mix in a cup. Don't mix in the cup of your airbrush or anything like that. Mix in a cup. That way you can see what's going on. You can see if you're getting chunks. I mean, if you splash it around and you see chunks that are sticking on the inside of your cup, you know that you have too much paint, or your paint is too thick, or you're having problems with your paint or something like that. We can see that in the cup. When we put it inside the cup of the airbrush, we can't see that. So we're not really knowing exactly how we're prepping it. Yes, when I'm lazy, I'm gonna mix right into my brush. It's a bad habit. I mean, it works, but it's kind of a bad habit to get into. Again, the better your hygiene is, the better your experience with the airbrush will be. So that's pretty much how we're going to kind of deal with drying tip and kind of back bleeding and stuff like that. Another problem that we'll notice is we're going to be spraying along, and then all of a sudden all your paint gets bubbles in it. And we're going to notice our paint's bubbling up and stuff like that. So what's happening now is it's almost the same thing as when we put that paper towel over the front of the brush and that we can squeeze it. We're forcing air back into the nozzle. That's what's happening when we get back bubbling or back bleed into the cup, is we're getting that air. It's going through the tip and it can't get out the tip. The air can't get out the tip because it runs across the front of the needle or the front of the nozzle, and it kind of ventures, and it's going to grab the paint and atomize the paint as it pulls it out, and then it's going to spray it. And that's this tip right here. That's an opening. You'll notice that sometimes your nozzle just barely leads through it, but around where your nozzle is, there's a little bit of an opening, and that's where the air goes through. So if we're holding that closed, we're going to force that air back into the cup. It's going to back bleed and bubble. If we're getting bubbling in the cup, what's happening is that air again is coming through the nozzle back in. So there's a couple of reasons for that. The first one and the most obvious reason is because we have some dry paint in the tip of the brush. Normally we're going to have this problem if we got done for the day, we cleaned our brush and everything, we put it away, and then we came back for a new session of painting, and we go start the painting and we're starting to get back bleeding. What's happening is we have some paint that's dried inside the nozzle, and it's not allowing the needle to press up against the nozzle smoothly to make that seal. You got a little paint in there, but it's not all the way around the nozzle. It's going to allow little ventures of air to squirt back in. So what we can do is, the first thing we want to do is, yes, we got to take our brush apart. We're going to pull the nozzle out. We're going to clean that nozzle really well. I like to just soak mine in alcohol, and then I just use these little micro applicators. These are really good for doing. Oh, this isn't one that doesn't have a thing on it. Here's one that has one. You can see they're like a little Q-tip almost at the end. These are called micro applicators. You can use them for glue. You can use them for whatever. You can get them at Hobby Lobby. You can get them on Amazon. You can get them Michaels. You can get them a lot of different. Well, I don't know if Michaels has them, but I just like to use these. We don't want to use those pipe cleaner brushes. You're going to see a lot of people. I mean, even airbrushes come with those pipe cleaners. I used to use just the nylon ones, and I thought I was good to go with those, but I was ruining brushes with those, and Ken finally kind of set me straight on that, and I got rid of the pipe cleaners, and it really held up. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and just take that nozzle out. We don't want our airbrush connected to air while we're doing this work, so make sure that you disconnect it. We're going to take that nozzle out, and I'm going to take some clear or some pure alcohol. I'm going to squirt some pure alcohol into that nozzle. I'm going to take that Q-tip, and I'm just going to gently run it in there. We want to be careful not to press at the end, especially, again, when we get with those really fine airbrushes, like the point twos and stuff like that, the infinities and stuff like that. That nozzle, that opening in that nozzle is very thin. The metal around is very thin, and we can actually press and misshape that nozzle just by pushing something as simple as a little piece of plastic in there. So we want to get in there with our Q-tip, and you can see it's coming out. It's nice and black. I was shooting some black earlier, so I haven't really cleaned my brush that well. Got a little bit of paint in there. I'm going to go ahead and clear that. Now, some companies make those little like three-sided nozzle cleaners, where it's like it matches the shape and shoulder of the nozzle and everything like that, but one edge of it is cut straight, so it's kind of sharp. I know a lot of companies make those, and they're really good to use and put in there. But what happens is every time that we run that little metal in there, we're going to put micro abrasions on the inside of that nozzle. By putting micro abrasions on, we're going to ruin that seal, that super microfine, super small tolerance seal that's created with the needle and the nozzle. We don't want to do that. By wearing that out, by using that little scraper, we're going to affect the opening of the inside of this thing. Does it matter to the company? No. Once you've worn out that nozzle, you're going to buy a new nozzle, right? So, I mean, it's just a bonus for them. We want to kind of try to get rid of that. One little hint, and I just almost did it now, whenever we're working with our airbrush, make sure we're working over a nice open area. Don't do it in your lap or over your seat or something like that, because some of these parts are really small. We can lose them, we can drop them and stuff like that. Don't do this over a sink or a garbage disposal, stuff like that. You're going to lose your nozzle, stuff like that. If you're going to do it by the sink, have a paper plate, a paper towel you're working over, something like that. Don't do it in the sink. Do it up on the counter, stuff like that. Make sure you got a nice area that you can work with. So I want to check my nozzle. and I want to make sure that it's nice and clear. Once that's clean, we're going to go ahead and reassemble it. We're going to gently put that on. And then we can go ahead and shoot. And if we're still getting that back bleeding, so we put everything together and put the air to it, and I'll just put water in it at this point and spray it. And if I'm still getting back bubbling, okay. So I know it wasn't the nozzle that was plugged. The next thing that we can check is this very end cap on our brushes. So we have two pieces on the head of the brush, and I can't remember exactly what they're called. But one is this piece, and you'll notice all the little holes in it. It's usually got like 5 or 6 holes in it. These are where the air goes through and ventures across the nozzle. Now we have this piece right here, and you'll notice on the inside of this there's usually this brass fitting right in here, and this brass fitting is slightly angled right in here. And what happens is your nozzle seats right into there, and your nozzle doesn't quite fit smoothly because we need the air to pass across that. Well, what will happen is we might have some paint built up in here, and it's not allowing that air to pass across the nozzle. So instead it's going to try to push its way back, and it's going to try to get through the seals back here into the nozzle housing there. So what we want to do is the same thing. We're going to go ahead and shoot this with some alcohol, get it nice and wet like that. And then I'm going to take that Q-tip that I have. You know, some of the Q-tips, they have those real nice Q-tips that come to like a conical face. Those are the nice ones to have. This isn't the greatest Q-tip. You can see how rough the cotton is on it. That's not real great to have. But anyways, I'm going to get in here and I'm just going to gently work this. Again, we don't want to mess up any of the tolerances in here. So we don't want to get in here with a pipe brush or something like that and really scrub in there. We're just going to kind of run this thing in here. And you'll notice when we do that, you'll notice you'll get this like black circle right there. So you can see I'm starting to get some paint built up in here. You know, we're gonna have paint build up in that. That's pretty normal. So it's not like the end of the world, but we want to make sure that that's nice and clear. You can look in there. That's nice and clear. Once that's nice and clear, the next thing I like to do while we already have this thing apart is I'm going to go ahead and seal up the threads real quick. So this thread right here that this cap threads onto, I'm just going to take a little bit of chapstick. I'm going to put a little bit of chapstick around the edge of that. That's a really good seal. We want to stay away from things like thread sealant or pipe dope or something like that. Those are going to build up. They're going to mislodge the seal, the threads. They're going to mislodge the housing. We run the risk of cross threading, stuff like that. So just a little bit of chapstick works really well. I'm going to go ahead and put some of that on. I'm going to thread this closed right here. Next, I have this little shoulder right here in the housing. So right here, I'll go ahead and take the needle out. Right here in the housing, I have this shoulder right here. And this is where the nozzle goes in and it seals against the brush. Sometimes we have a seal in here, sometimes we don't. This little shoulder is what will leak air sometimes. So what I can do is I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to take some chapstick and I'm going to put it right on the back of the nozzle. So you can see that, whoop, these nozzles are nice and slick and real small. But you can see right on the back of the nozzle here, I have this shoulder right here. This is what fits into that seal there. So I'll just take and run a little bit of chapstick. You can put it on an applicator or whatever. And we'll run just a little bit of chapstick around the back of that nozzle. And then I'm going to go ahead and seat that nozzle back in. I'll put my needle back in so I kind of have a little guide for my nozzle. I'm going to seat that nozzle with the chapstick on it. I'm going to seat that back in. And then we'll put the cap back on. Now at this point, when I'm threading it in, I don't want to reef down on this thing. These things aren't made to be like pliered on. If you're having to plier this thing on, you've got some problems with those seals in there. But I do want to make sure it's relatively firm. I want to get in there and it needs to be not just tightened. I want to make sure it's nice and firm because that can cause back bubbling too if this cap's not quite tight. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of firmly reef on that. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my needle's set all the way in. And check all that. I'm going to go ahead and hook it back up to the air, put some water into it, see if it's back bubbling. That hopefully solved the problem. If that hasn't solved the problem and we're still back bubbling after all of this, something has happened. We've kind of messed up one of the seals in there. The next thing I can do is take all of this apart and I'm going to put a new nozzle into this brush. Sometimes I'll replace this cap too. Like the Sotars and everything with the nozzle, you can get a new end cap here. I'll replace that end cap, and I'm going to replace that nozzle. I'm going to put all that back in, and I'm going to try it again. If it's still back bubbling after all of that, we've replaced the nozzle, we've replaced the end cap, we've cleaned everything, we know that everything is clean, we're still getting back bubbling in, that means that we've done something inside here, and we've ruined that seal. What's going to happen now is we're going to have to send the airbrush back to the manufacturer and see if they can't refinish the inside of it. I don't know the tricks that Badger uses, but I know that there's been a few times I've sent a brush back that's been pretty wiped out, and he's been able to fix it. So that's pretty much how we kind of take care of back bubbling. We've kind of talked about the dry tip. Now, what happens if we're spraying it and we're getting some weird things that are happening? One, we're either getting a misshapen pattern, or we're getting a lot of dry tip, or we're getting a whistling noise. You're going to hear a whistle noise. You'll be spraying, it'll kind of make a slight whistle to it. So the first thing that might be is it might be just dry tip. Dry tip we can simply fix. It's easy. We're going to take that needle. We're going to take our Q-tip. We're going to dip it in that alcohol. We're going to clean the needle off real quick. Then I'm going to go ahead and back that needle off once it's clean, and I'm going to clean this tip of the nozzle really good too. I want to get in there and try to get that as clean as possible. Put the airbrush back together, see how it's spraying. If we're still getting that really odd spray pattern, or if it's still whistling and stuff, there's one of two things that happen. We either bent the needle, or we've split the nozzle. Splitting a nozzle is really hard to tell. There's been a few times where I took the nozzle out and I looked at it and everything, and it didn't look split, but it ended up, if you really looked at it, it had a split, or maybe we oblonged it. So the nozzle is kind of shaped like this with the opening, and the ends kind of flared out because the needle got shoved through too hard or something like that. That's going to cause it to act really weird. We're going to get some weird feed. We're going to get some weird spray like that, or the needle's bent. We bent that needle. I know that some places they said that you can get in there and with a fine file, you can get back in and refile that needle and nozzle. Or that needle. You can't file a nozzle. Once the nozzle's messed up, you're done. You got to replace the nozzle. But you can't get that needle out. It's very tough. I can't do it, so I don't. I tried to straighten needles a little bit and get them to work for the rest of the day. But once I know that needle's done, I'm going to just go purchase a new one. That's one of the things I really like about the Badger is that it's affordable. The needle and nozzle is only like $19 a set. That's not too bad to have, whereas like with my Infinity, the needle and nozzle is very expensive on this. I think the needle is like $40 and the nozzle is like $45 or something like that. So with this one, I want to be a lot more cognizant. But you'll notice how much further that needle sticks out for one, and you'll notice how much finer it is. I mean, the tip of that needle is very fine. So we got to be really careful with these really fine airbrush needles and nozzles. We don't want to mess those up. So that's kind of the basics for troubleshooting. I think those are usually the most common problems that we run into with airbrushing. Is there any other problems that you guys have run into that you guys want to ask about? If you do, you can go ahead and unmute and just ask the questions.
Yeah, actually, I'll kick this off. Occasionally, from time to time, I'll get buildup on the tip that causes the spray to go in one angle or another. And even after a thorough cleaning, it seems like the cone is not centered to the airbrush. Did I just miss something, or is it further down from in the nozzle that I have to clean?
You're probably still getting clogging in your nozzle. If you do that flush technique that I was talking about with the back bleed and all that stuff, that hopefully should clear it. If not, you've got some. Normally, you're going to run into that problem when you've let paint dry in your brush. If you've let paint dry in your brush and you've gone back and started shooting, maybe at first you weren't noticing it so much, but what's happened is that a new fresh layer of paint has been sprayed over that old layer that's dried and it's hardened into the airbrush, and it just keeps wanting to stick to it. And no matter how well you clean it, it just slowly starts building up. And you're talking micro amounts of paint. It's going to slowly build its way up, and you're going to notice that you're just going to keep having problems. It's going to keep loading. It's going to keep loading. It's going to keep loading. The best thing there is take that airbrush apart, clear that nozzle, try to clean it up. If you let like primer dry in your brush, just pretty much take that nozzle and needle and replace it, because primer is really, really difficult to get out of a brush once it's dried. Your nozzle and needle are usually pretty wiped out. I mean, you can get in there with scrub brushes and with those edged fitting nozzle tools and stuff like that, but it's just going to be a stopgap. You're going to be able to clean your brush a little bit, but now you're putting all these micro abrasions into that nozzle. It's just going to keep wanting to collect paint and stuff like that. More likely than not, that's what's happened. So if you do the couple little steps I was talking about, do that back feeding, make sure that you clear the brush really well, take that Q-tip, clear that nozzle, clear that needle, take that tip off, maybe even clear that tip where that air is, because it could just be the air is being displaced, not necessarily the nozzle. Normally in that case where you're getting that really weird spray and it is like paint buildup back more than just in the needle, you're also going to have a whistling noise with it. It's going to sound weird when the air is spraying. So that's usually a pretty good telltale that that's going on. You'll hear that little bit of whistle. Any other questions?
That was pretty cool. That was a lot of information. When you were doing that white card, because I know that's like a super, super helpful tool, and spraying to test your PSI and the density of your paint or the viscosity of your paint, that's like a, I think we use in class, we just use glossy cardstock paper for that part of it.
Yeah.
Just so that they know what to use. That you're not going to get the same effect if you spray that on regular paper.
Right, and that's what we talked about right at the start, is that if you use a paper towel or you use just regular paper, it's going to absorb the paint. So you're not going to see what the paint's doing. Your model doesn't absorb the paint. Your paint goes on the surface of the model. So we want something that's semi close to the surface of the model. I mean, if you have a piece of plastic that you've primed, a nice big square of plastic or something, that works just as well. You know, you can always have like permanent things that you use that you could always just clean with some alcohol every time you get done with it, stuff like that. That there wouldn't be a problem with something like that either. But yeah, I just like the glossy cardstock. I'll usually just use business cards. They're like the easiest to use. So I usually have some business cards.
Mailers.
Yeah, mailers, any of that stuff, right? Cool.
Right on. And what's, if you were to say there's the #1 thing that causes problems and the airbrush, I know what your answer is here, but for your airbrush to quit working, what is the #1 thing that always happens?
You didn't paint. You didn't prep your paint properly.
What do you mean by that?
You're not thinning your paint properly. Your consistency is not what you need. If you're constantly clogging, I mean, the first thing you need to look at is your paint prep and see if you're thinning your paint properly.
Awesome. One of the things that we show in our workshops too is to strain your paint using nylon.
Especially if you're using the old GW pots or the P3 pots. These are really notorious for it, because what happens is, you know, you open this pot and you have it open and you're painting with it and you're getting paint out and off and on. You're going to get paint that's up along the sides of it and stuff like that. That's instantly wanting to dry. It's instantly trying to get air on it. The surface of the pot is going to collect air. And what happens is that heavy paint sinks to the bottom of the paint. So you'll look at your paint pot and, you know, you're going to shake it. Every time, you know, you get a pot of paint out, our tendency is to shake it real quick. All of that congealed paint that's already started to cure, it's not going to go back into the paint and uncure. It's going to go back to the bottom of the thing. And it's going to be this kind of congealed gunk. You'll notice when you get to the end of a pot of paint, you're always going to have this really congealed gunk at the bottom. A lot of that is paint that's set up. So it's pretty notorious with these style of paint, with the lid top style of paints. You're going to get that. If it's the squeeze bottle style, it's a lot rarer that you're going to get clumps in your paint. So you don't have to worry about that unless you're doing like apple barrel or one of those kind of paints. For some reason, those ones have a tendency right from the factory to have congealed paint in them. So you want to be aware of that. It's really easy to do that. What we're going to do is we're just going to take our regular mixing cup. We're going to take a little bit of pantyhose and put it, just lay it over the top of the cup. Then we're going to pour our paint through the pantyhose. We don't want to squeeze the paint. A lot of people are like, man, I got to get every drop of my paint out. I'm going to squeeze it through the pantyhose and try to get as much of that paint out. We don't want to do that because we just squeeze that congealed stuff. We're just going to make those little openings in the pantyhose wider. It's going to stretch and it's going to let the stuff squeeze through, right? Once it squeezes through, we're just putting that stuff back into the brush. That excess paint that we take off with the pantyhose, I mean, throw it away. If you're that concerned about saving paint, it's probably worth it to just go buy a new bottle and leave that one as just a regular brush pot.
Nice.
So, I don't know, in between on that one. So Tim had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, just kind of a follow-up on the the paint. So I have a chrome that I'm using for fine detail, and I'm using a 105, or excuse me, 360 with a broad needle to do like, just a broad coating. And I find that metallics, they clog the chrome, and that's pretty obvious. I get that one. But the when I'm spraying metallics through the 360, they tend to go every which way, and the flake just goes everywhere. Is that a result of not thinning it properly, or is that just kind of how metallics work through an airbrush?
That one, it depends on your metallics you're shooting. Because what most metallics are made up is they're just an acrylic paint with some mica flakes in it. Some companies use aluminum flakes. What happens is the mica flakes, when they come out of the brush, they want to fly. They want to float. We're mixing air with the paint. So we're atomizing the paint, but it wants to separate the mica flakes from the paint. So you're going to get mica flakes that are floating all over the place. You're going to get that with Minotaur. You're going to get that with I want to say some of the, especially some of the brush on, usually the brush on metallics, you're going to run into that. Because the mica flakes are so fine that they're going to run everywhere. Reaper is pretty dominant with that. So some of the things that you fix doesn't mean you got to get rid of that paint. Lower your air pressure, and that will help a little bit. I'm getting some backlight on somebody's mic. Lower your air pressure a little bit. That will help. And then also, if you add just a little bit of an additive to your paint, like some flow improver or something like that, yes, it's going to make that metallic more transparent, but it will help bond that paint just a little bit more. The best thing I would say is get airbrush ready metallics. The Vallejo airbrush ready metallics are really good, except I don't like the golds. I've had a lot of problems with the golds clumping, but I love like their silvers and stuff like that. The GW metallics are fantastic. The air metallics, they're fantastic to shoot through the airbrush. I really like those. And the scale 75 shoot really well through the airbrush. Now, the reason you're getting that clogging in the chrome is even airbrush ready paints, I need to thin whenever I shoot them out of the chrome or the Sotar. It doesn't matter if they're airbrush ready, Minotaur or whatever. I always tend to clog with those. So I thin those paints. And most people don't want to thin their metallics because the minute you start thinning them, they start to become pretty transparent. It means you're doing a lot more coats. People have a tendency to stay away from thinning their metallics. So if you want to shoot those with the chrome, you just need to thin them a little better. And then lower your air pressure a little bit. So I hope that answered that. So George, you have a question?
Yeah. What happens, sometimes when I'm using the airbrush on there too, and I can tell, and hopefully you didn't cover this early, I missed like the first 2 minutes of it, but when I'm pushing the trigger down, and it's a double action, and when you push the trigger down, it's not supposed to spray any paint, but as soon as you push it down, the air starts going through it, and then the paint starts coming through, even though you haven't started pulling it back yet.
So yeah. What's happening is your needle is not seating into the nozzle. So it's one of three problems. So you have one of three problems. One, either it's at the start of the day, or we run into this all the time with brand new badges. Brand new badges are shipped with the needle slightly pulled back. We didn't seat the needle all the way. So what you want to do is just check to make sure that needle's seated. We're going to go ahead and take it like this. We're going to press it in there. Now what will happen sometimes, we'll get some paint that's dried up on the nozzle here. That's not allowing that needle to seat all the way. What I'll do is I'll spin I'll just gently press. I mean, don't press hard because you run the risk of flaring the end of that nozzle. I'm just going to gently kind of spin that needle as I press it in, and then I'll tighten it up. So I'll spin that needle around like maybe twice. I'll just kind of spin it. And what that's going to do is going to press into that slightly dried, slightly wet paint. Then go ahead and try it. If we're still getting paint to spray, that needle is not seating. It means that we need to pull that nozzle off and we need to clean that dried paint that's in there. The other thing that could have happened, though, is you might have split your nozzle. And if you split your nozzle is now bigger than the needle. So no matter how far you press that needle in, that nozzle is still going to allow some paint to leak by. So we want to be aware of that. You want to take a look at that nozzle, see if it looks flared at the end, or see if it's got a little micro fracture. It'll split. And every time you press that needle into it and the air pressure hits, it's going to open that crack a little more. So you might just barely see that crack. You might not. I mean, it's going to be really fine. It's going to be hard to see. But if it's there, if it's cracked nozzle, you need to replace that nozzle.
Right on. George, did you get to ask your question?
Yeah, he did. Actually, I had another question too, if you don't mind. Actually, I also have a. I know it's not a badger, but it's the Iwata. Actually, sorry, I got a couple of them. The Eclipse. And I noticed on my clips periodically too, for some reason, when I put the paint in there and all of a sudden when I spray, and I might have a bad habit of when I spray too, I mean, because when I talked to the manufacturer, they said I need to start the air first and then pull the trigger back. I have a tendency just to push the button and immediately pull back, but you get a splatter.
Yes. Yeah. So what happened, and especially with the Eclipse, because the Eclipse is a lot like the Patriot. It's got a very big nozzle with a real nice opening on it, and it's got a very thick needle with a real sharp shoulder. So what happens is every time that needle goes forward, it's going to collect paint on the end of that needle, and it's going to take a glob of paint and it's going to press it out in front of that nozzle. So every time that we pull that needle back and we come forward, that's a really important thing to know when I was talking about how you come off the model and clear. As soon as that needle comes back forward, there's going to be a glob of paint that's on the tip of that needle. So what we want to do is every time before we come onto a model, we want to make sure we apply the air first, come onto the model to the point we're going to spray, and then we slowly roll the needle back until we start applying paint. But get in the habit of turning that air on off of the model. That's going to happen with almost every brush. The only brush I know that doesn't do that is the Grex TGI, the trigger one. The reason being is that even though it's a dual action, when you pull the trigger, it applies the air first, and you have to actually microly pull the trigger back just a second, but a microsecond, not even a second, but a microsecond. You got to pull that trigger back before it engages the needle. So what's going to happen is every time that you're letting the needle out, as soon as that needle clears, there's still a little spray of air pushing across that needle. So it clears the needle for you as it goes out, instead of whereas with us, we don't apply the air until we're starting to pull the needle back. We've already got the paint loaded. Okay. So the TGI, that's one thing that's really trick about the TGI. That's one thing I noticed about that. I was like, that's really cool. I love that technique. You don't get that spatter. It really helps limit that spatter because of as soon as you close that trigger, it still has just a burst of air at the very end while the needle's already closed.
That's probably why he also said that too. When you put the needle back, you had to push it all the way forward and keep the air pressed down and let air go through it for a while first before you stop. And that's my biggest thing. I always have a habit when I'm done painting, I just release the trigger.
Sure, and I do the same thing. I just got in the habit of making sure that I turn on my air off of the model, and then I come back on the model. So when I go out and do that little clear, make sure that needle's clear. You know, I'm spraying my model. I'm going to go off of it. I'm going to clear it. I'm going to come back onto the model. When I'm coming across right here, the air's on. Now I'm starting to apply paint right here.
Right on. Anybody else? That was a lot of information, man. Woo! I don't know if you breathe through some of that.
All right. Well, I mean, if that's it for questions, I think that's all I have for tonight. So thanks for joining us. If you have any more questions, feel free to post on the Hobby Hangout. You'll get a lot of answers there. A lot of people, very active site. So be sure that you can ask your questions there, or feel free to come by CK Studios and message either Kat or myself, and we should be able to help you through any of those questions you have.
Right on. Thanks, guys. We'll see you on the next Hangout.
All right, good night.
Thanks.